Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Agustina Paglayan. Agustina is a political scientist and public policy professor at the University of California in San Diego and non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. She is an expert in the interplay between politics and education. She has a master's in education policy. She also has a PhD in political science. She has received numerous awards from the American Political Science Association. She is consulted for the United Nations, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and her writings have been featured in The Economist, The Washington Post, and other outlets. She is the author of the new book, Raised to Obey, The Rise and Spread of Mass Education. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about how education is used as a tool for political and social order. We talk about theories of education and the explicit aims of government education. We also talk about early critical thinking, nationalism, and education worldwide. We also discuss mass education and violence, indoctrination, curriculums, teachers, quality education, and many more topics. This was an absolutely wonderful conversation, very detailed, very thought-provoking, much like her book is. I really had a fantastic time with her. She's such a wonderful person, very lovely and quite sharp, quite bright. I really enjoyed my engagement with her. She made me think, she pushed me, and I really enjoy those types of conversations. As always, you can have this conversation and all other conversations if you subscribe to my Substack, convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So get over there, subscribe, share with everybody. And now I bring you Agustina Paglayan. I'm here with Agustina Paglayan. Agustina, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I am greatly looking forward to talking to you.
Thank you so much, Xavier, for having me.
Yes. You have written, as I was telling you before we started, a really wonderful book. Challenged me, think about things in a different way. It's very global in a lot of ways, which I like, on education. So I was very happy to read it and super excited to talk about it. The book is called Raised to Obey, The Rise and Spread of Mass Education. This is out through the wonderful Princeton University Press. So we're going to talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners a snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, any relevant details, and how you were able to write the book.
Of course. So again, my name is Agustina Paglayan. I'm a political science and public policy professor at the University of California, San Diego. Before I became an academic, I worked on education reform in a number of developing countries through my previous job at the World Bank. And so we'll talk later about how some of those experiences informed the motivation for writing the book. But basically, the way that I approach my research is informed by those experiences and also by my interdisciplinary training. I have training in economics, in education policy, in public policy, and in political science. And so I approach questions through this interdisciplinary lens and also drawing a lot on history as well.
That's great. I mean, that's anytime I talk to scientists or researchers or professors that are using an interdisciplinary approach, I always feel like it's such a fuller conversation, a fuller perspective, because you're able to kind of see things, and how they kind of dance with each other, and that's really what you need. You need an interdisciplinary approach. So, you have. It sounds like you have quite the CV there. So that's great. That's what you want. So okay. So for the book, you make an interesting argument, which I'm curious to hear how you got there and why you make it. So a lot of the times people, you mentioned this in the book, feel that education is to fight against poverty and inequality, and it doesn't sound like you disagree with that, but you're trying to make the kind of very pointed, direct claim that mass education was created and maintained by central government systems to promote social order and to have political stability. We'll talk about indoctrination later. But yeah, tell us about, I guess, your thesis and how it's a little bit different than how most people see kind of primary education or mass education, at a kind of bigger scale.
Totally. So it's different from how most people see and how different from how I used to think of education when I began studying this. So like I said before, I worked on education reform for a number of years in different developing countries, primarily in Latin America, not exclusively. But what led me to become interested in working on education reform is this belief that education can lift people out of poverty, can improve people's lives, can empower you to live an autonomous life, to pursue your dreams, to have dreams in the first place, and so on and so forth. And at the same time that I had this narrative in my mind of what education systems are about, through my job, I also got to see how many education systems around the world are not living up to that potential. And there's one statistic that I cite at the very beginning of the book that paints the picture, which is that 1/3 of children who have 4 years of schooling cannot read a simple sentence. And so there's this big disconnect between schooling versus skills. Kids are going to school. Almost all countries in the world have accomplished universal access to primary education, and yet the education systems that they are accessing are not living up to their potential to equip people with the skills that they need to escape poverty and inequality. And so I was really curious to understand what is behind that disconnect. And one of the potential explanations was that governments are really trying hard to improve students' skills and to level the playing field and empower people through education, but they are just not capable of doing it because they just don't have enough good information on what are the types of education policies that are best suited to accomplish these goals. And the perspective that the book provides is different from this perspective. The perspective of the book begins by simply questioning, are governments interested in the first place in expanding and providing education for the sake of leveling the playing field, or do we have education systems for a different reason? And that's what led me to study in what then became a book, but over the course of 10 years, I decided to go back in time to the foundational period when these various education systems, primary education systems, regulated by the state, were created in Europe, in Latin America, primarily in the Western world, to see were governments setting up these systems, regulating the education of children, providing access to primary education for everyone, out of an interest in improving people's skills, equipping them with tools to escape poverty, and so on, or were they interested in a different set of goals? And that's where I discovered, by looking at the kinds of arguments that politicians made at the time when they were creating the systems, at the way in which the systems were designed from the get-go, and so on, that the goal was actually not the democratic ideals that we have in mind. The goal was really about social order, about transforming a population of lower class individuals who they saw as unruly, as savage, as barbarian, into obedient citizens who would respect the state, its authority, and the state's laws. And so with the idea that if you targeted children, these unruly children of the lower classes from a very young age, and from that age you taught them to respect authority and respect rules, then through the course of your life, of their lives, they would continue to do that, and you would have social order and political stability. So that's what I discovered. It wasn't the original hypothesis with which I started off, but we'll talk about how the evidence was just undeniable once I started studying the topic, that this was really the main goal behind the creation and expansion of state-regulated primary education systems in the Western world.
So are you telling me that we go to school, and particularly primary education, which you highlight, and for some of the listeners in the United States, primary education is usually elementary, middle school, secondary is high school, and so forth. That it's not about being literate, right? Have I been lied to so many years? And I was told I go to school and you learn, basics of how to live in life, and if you get a good education, you'll be able to have a good job and you'll be able to be successful human being in society. Is that all a sham? Is it, is education, at least let's say public for now, is not meant to make us literate, especially when it started in the well, I guess it started earlier, but once you get the printing press and you get people start to have books, and then you got to read the books, and so by the time you get to the 18th and 19th century, you want people to be literate, because that's how they're, we when we look at, in social sciences, we look at as a variable education level, right, to show how much their cognitive abilities are in X, Y, and Z. So is that all a lie? What do we make about all of that, all those pieces? Is it just to contain social order and things like that? What's the story here?
The issue of literacy that you bring up is an interesting one, and I'll get to that. The first thing I want to do, though, is to distinguish between the current goals of education systems versus the original goals of education systems. And so if you think about the current goals of many education systems, not all of them, but I do think that today there are education systems around the world where promoting social order through obedience and disciplining of children is not the only goal, and there are additional goals, including ensuring everyone is literate, ensuring everyone knows a certain level of math, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, those goals are in some ways secondary goals, in the sense that those goals are only allowed by the state to be added as long as they don't threaten the ultimate goal of education to promote social order. So what you see in different countries in more current contexts is that once a government perceives that the type of education it is providing suddenly starts becoming destabilizing, because it says, suddenly people are as a result of being more literate, they're reading radical stuff, subversive stuff. Once the government makes that assessment, then they kind of roll back and they go back to this focus on education being primarily about disciplining, social order, obedience, and so on and so forth. And we can come back to examples from 21st century cases where that's been the case. But just to distinguish between sort of the current goals that include social order, but some additional ones, as long as those additional goals don't threaten the goal of promoting social order, versus the historical, original impetus for creating these systems, which really had very little to do with creating a literate population. To the extent that literacy was taught, it was as part primarily of reinforcing the state's social control agenda. So you were teaching children reading and writing, and primarily reading more so than writing, through books that had a lot of content focused on moral values that you were trying to instill. So you weren't learning how to read and write with neutral content, such as today is a sunny day, tomorrow will be cloudy. Kids were learning how to read with books that had a heavy component of moral education, and those texts that they were reading said things such as, if I behave well and I follow the school rules and my teacher's orders, I'm gonna be praised by my peers and everyone will love me. And if it was a version of religious moral education, then they added, I'll go to heaven. And then if I don't respect these rules and I don't follow my teacher's instructions, others are gonna think poorly of me. And if it was the religious version, it also added, and I'm gonna go to hell. So the instruction in reading and writing was being used as part of this moral education agenda that the state had, without the goal of that literacy that you were acquiring being put to the service of then learning other things. There was actually a concern, if anything, that if you learned how to read and write, you could start reading other materials that could lead you to question stuff. But the reason why most political rulers ended up not being very concerned that that would actually happen was because they said, we're going to control all the textbooks. We're going to determine which textbooks are available. We're going to set up the libraries that regular people, not elites, regular people will have access to, and that's the only way they'll be able to get books. And so we'll make sure that the content that they are exposed to is one that reinforces these ideas that the state is the only one with the authority to apply violence, that individuals should never use violence to protest, and a whole range of different moral values that the state was trying to instill for the sake of consolidating its authority.
I'll come back to because you talk about in the book the variable of curriculums, because this becomes a huge thing. And again, just here in the U.S., you see people fight about this all the time about curriculums. What are in textbooks? What are we teaching kids? Blah blah blah. And you'll have different political divisions say, we should put this, we should not put this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which I guess is fine in a quote unquote representative democracy. You should kind of argue and fight about what to do and what not to do. But more of the bigger picture here, you talk about these human capital theories of education, the value-centered theories of education, and the state-building theory of education. I love me some good theory. So tell me the overview of these theories of education, and I guess more specific to that, how is centralized federal government. So here in the United States, more modernly, but even you can say more from examples that you give in the book, such as in Prussia or in Argentina or in, I think, Chile you mentioned as well in the book. Either in the past or currently, how do we see centralized governments that have a Department of Education or a Ministry of Education? How are they using some of these theories, or using different theories, and what that looks like, or how does that play out based on what they're kind of basing it off of, kind of in this wide macro view?
Yeah. So let me split different arguments that people have proposed for why states and governments generally doesn't just have to be centralized states. Why governments generally have an interest in regulating and providing primary education for everyone. So one common set of theories argues that, and this would be the human capital theories of education, that what lies behind those government efforts is the goal of equipping people with skills and knowledge that improve their economic productivity. And so there are a number of different reasons why the state or a government may want to do that. It could be, for instance, because suddenly democracy has come around and you've enfranchised the population, and people are asking you to give them an education that improves their access to better jobs, and so on and so forth. It could be because the government is trying to industrialize the country, and as part of that, it's trying to form a large skilled workforce. It could be because the government is worried about international military rivalry, and as part of being able to fight and win international wars, it wants to create skilled soldiers. But all of these various different reasons are different reasons for why a government ultimately might want to provide education with the goal of equipping the population with skills and knowledge that improve their productivity. And so these are what I call, and people in economics primarily would call, human capital theories of education, where the goal of education is to improve human capital. There's a different set of explanations, which are what I call value-centered theories of education, where the goal, according to these explanations, of governments regulating and providing education is not primarily to improve the skills and knowledge of the population, but rather to mold their values, attitudes, beliefs, political behavior, and so on and so forth. And again, in there you have a number of different theories for what might prompt a government to be interested in using education for the sake of molding people's attitudes, beliefs, values, and so on. So one possibility could be that you have a government, again, that maybe is fighting a lot of wars with other countries, and as part of inoculating the population from external threats, wants to create a very patriotic citizenry. And so they're using education to instill nationalism, essentially. And so those are the types of values that they're trying to mold through education, is this sort of nationalist values that they're trying to instill. You could also have a situation in which there's a wave of immigration, that people are worried about immigrants not being sufficiently assimilated to the local national culture, and so that they're using education in response to immigration, again, to mold immigrants' beliefs and sort of disseminate a common set of values and culture and so on across everyone in the population. There's a number of different reasons for what could drive a government to invest in education for the sake of molding people's political values, political beliefs, and so on and so forth. And my argument in Raised to Obey is that value-centered theories do capture the main goal behind the creation of state-regulated primary education systems. So I do argue that molding people's political, moral values also was the main goal behind these systems. But I depart from other arguments in terms of what is really the set of values that are trying to be instilled, and what prompts states to become interested in this value inculcation. And so, like I said before, for example, some people would say, well, maybe it's about instilling nationalism. And that's where I depart from that. And I say, no, it's not. Even before education systems start instilling nationalism, even before then, what they're focusing on is instilling obedience and respect for the state. And so here, what the focus is on instilling a set of moral values that teach people that respecting the state's authority without question is the right moral thing to do. That it is not morally correct to not follow the state's rules. And the idea here is that the state's strategy toward accomplishing this molding of people's values is by targeting children from a very young age, with the idea that if you're very young, and from a very young age, you learn to respect the teacher's authority, and the teacher is an agent representing the state, then you're going to continue through the rest of your lives, after having internalized that respecting the teacher's authority and respecting the school rules is the right thing to do. That if you don't do these things, you're a deviant, you're a problematic person. Once you internalize that the right thing to do is to follow rules, that rules are there for a reason, because someone set those rules because they knew better, and that you need to follow those rules. The idea is that if kids learned this from a very young age, that would lead them in the long term not to question the state's authority, and that would strengthen the state's capacity to forge social order. And so in that sense, that's a state-building argument. It's an argument about education being used to mold people's values, especially their moral values, so that they accept that it is morally incorrect for them to rebel against the state. That what is morally correct is to accept without question the state's authority and its rules. And that's state building in the sense that to the extent that people do incorporate these ideas, then that consolidates the political power of the state.
I have many follow-up questions here.
Okay.
I'm thinking very hard as you're saying all these things, and I have a lot of I have some questions here. okay, the first thing, what and this might be country specific and time specific, but to what extent are these aims made explicitly clear, or are they more subversive and they're more implicit in their intentions or their aims? I think that's important, no? If you're going to say we're going to educate people from, kindergarten, first grade, all the way up to, whatever, primary school, secondary school, are they explicit in what they're saying they're doing? We're going to, train you with these more, or they say, kind of the thing I was kind of, half joking about is, well, no, you need to be highly educated and learn a set of skills and blah, 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 blah. But really, we want to, teach you all these morals and values and to be state obedient, blah, blah, blah. What's the kind of explicit, implicit kind of messaging that you see happens with some of these countries that do this?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that, because that's part of what led me to write the book. Is they are extremely explicit. They are not hiding their intention at all. So I'll give you some examples. At the time when France passes its first national primary education law, which regulates all kinds of things about the education system, the curriculum, how teachers have to be trained, what years you have to go to school, and so on and so forth, the Minister of Education, who drafts the law and goes to Parliament to defend the law, he says, look, the goal of primary education is to improve the moral character of the people, and it is not a goal of primary education to improve the economic well-being of the poor. He says that explicitly, and he says, some people might argue that I am cold, that I don't care about the poor, but that's not the case. I do care about the poor. It's just that what the state can actually do to improve the poor people's lives is to improve the moral character of the poor. And he then goes on to say, and that is also what is in the state's best interest. It is in the state's best interest to improve the moral life of the poor, because by improving their moral character, that's the best guarantee of social order that the state can have. More so than any kind of repression or economic concessions to the poor, the best thing that the state can do to guarantee social order and consolidate thrones and societies is to instill obedience to the sovereign and its laws. And it's just, this isn't stuff that I'm sort of extrapolating. These are literally the words that they are using. Mm-hmm. In the case of Prussia, the first primary education royal decree that introduces the first compulsory primary education system says the goal of education is to break the child's will. It is not about empowering kids or teaching them literacy or any of the other things that we might think. It's about breaking the child's will and converting the child into someone who is completely submissive and subservient to the king's authority. So there's no hiding. And the king there as well says, I'm not interested in improving the economic well-being of the poor. In fact, I don't want education to accomplish that, because if that's what education does, we're going to have peasants running off to the cities, and we will not have enough peasants in the countryside where we need them to stay to do the work that we want them to do. And so like this, there are all kinds of different stories in the US as well. You have, particularly after Shays' Rebellion, a lot of different political elites who say, well, we need to start emulating European countries in terms of what they're doing to control their population. And in the same way that Prussia has used education to indoctrinate people I'm using literal words here, okay? I'm like sort of almost quoting Horace Mann on this. In the same way that Prussia is using education to indoctrinate people for the sake of an absolutist regime, we need to do the same, but for the support and perpetuation of republican institutions. We need to teach people, and you have other people, Benjamin Rush, John Quincy Adams, Thomas Jefferson, many others who are saying we need an education for the common person so that they learn obedience and they learn submission. And these were the words that they used. So it's not sort of a cynical interpretation of history. It's just the realistic interpretation of history from reading the way that people talked about the goals of education. And it can sound very sort of counterintuitive based on how we think of education today. We think of education.
But this is what I was gonna. This is sorry. This I was gonna say. People would say, well, this was in the 18th century, 19th century, but we update it, right? We have the modern era. We don't do that anymore. All we do is now we just teach people. We educate them. Here's your math. Here's your English. Here's your science. Here's your history. Yes, it's curated through various curriculums, but the goal of it is now in a modern era, to not maybe do so much of that anymore. Or is your claim, no, we have the infrastructure, we have the skeleton of how these things, we have the institutions that were designed this way, and through decades, they just kept building off of that and never changed. What's the argument here, I guess, of when this arose in these countries you're saying, as to how it's maybe not so different now in a modern context?
It's not so different now, and I'll tell you a little bit about the kind of data that I present in the book to back up that conclusion. But the first thing I'll say is like I said earlier, surely there are additional goals to education today. And yet, if you look in the United States, in almost all states, you have the Pledge of Allegiance, right? And kids who are 5 years old are starting the school day, saying, I pledge allegiance to the U.S. flag and to the republic for which it stands. And we're talking about 5-year-olds, many of whom don't even know how to write their name. They don't even know what a republic is, and yet they are pledging allegiance to a republic. And so that is a component of very clear indoctrination. Indoctrination in the sense of instilling a specific set of beliefs, in this case, that Republican institutions are the best form of government, without allowing for critical thinking, for questioning, for debating, for any of this. And the US is very interesting in that respect, in that there are many aspects of the curriculum in which critical thinking is allowed, but usually not so much when it comes to certain political beliefs. The belief that you should never protest violently, the belief that if you are upset with how things are, you should express it either through voting or by protesting peacefully. The belief that democracy and a Republican form of government are the best choice. These are things that are beyond the debates that happen in a school. And kids are sort of have to memorize these things. They're not engaging with these beliefs critically. And so in that respect, education continues to use kind of the old infrastructure for the same old purpose of instilling a specific set of beliefs that justify the status quo. Now, the other challenge I think that some countries face when they do want things to change, and you have some countries, again, it's not a majority, it's a very small number of countries that say, okay, we want an education that will promote more critical thinking. The challenge that many countries, or all countries face, if they wanted to do that, is the infrastructure that they've inherited. That the infrastructure they've inherited was not designed, was not thought for the goal of promoting critical thinking. And so what you end up having is all of these classrooms. You can do a Google search, classroom in Guatemala, classroom in France, classroom in whatever, primary school in country of your choice, and you're going to get the same picture that is essentially indistinguishable. Some have better infrastructure than others, but the basic setup is you have a teacher standing in the front, desks arranged in rows, and that very basic design already gives the teacher a place of authority in the classroom, already puts the children in this sort of more submissive type of relationship with the teacher, in which the teacher is the one that dispenses the truth that the kids have to memorize if they want to get a good grade and they want to keep kind of progressing, and not so much the kind of setup that an architect might design if they wanted to have debate. You might arrange things in a circle without the teacher standing at the center. You might have kids moving around instead of sitting still in their chairs, and so on and so forth. So even for someone who wants to promote critical thinking today, it's very difficult to do it within the constraints of the infrastructure that has been inherited. And if you wanted an education that does actually live up to its potential to promote critical thinking, you would have to rethink the education systems that we have from the root. You would have to essentially really transform the way that classrooms are designed, the way that teachers are trained, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Let me ask two things here.
Yeah, you're welcome to disagree.
No. I mean, this is why I loved your book. Listeners are hearing literally why I loved your book, because it made me think about a lot of these things in certain ways. So it's great. It's great. I love how you explain it. The first thing here is, now this is a valued judgment, the way I'm framing the question. So what's wrong? There's the critical word there. What this sounds bad when it comes out. I mean, what's wrong with having a little control over what we're trying to put into people's heads about, oh God, that sounds like such a terrible statement when I say it out loud. But like, okay, let me back this up. Okay, if you take a child, on the one hand, we know that children are developing cognitively, emotionally, academically, et cetera, interpersonally, socially. But we also know that children are very concrete. We know cognitive development, that humans are very concrete, black or white. It's this or it's that. It's, kind of a binary of sorts. As they continue to progress, your brain sort of literally comes online, and you start to get more abstraction as you get older, right? And usually it's the last, ages 15 to 25 is where you're getting, better abstraction, decision making, whatever. So, yeah, what else are you supposed to do? You can't have critical thinking with 6-year-olds. You can't, or 9-year-olds. Like, not entirely. Like, you do need to have some like order, some kind of constancy, some kind of, routines. Like, that's what you need at a home. That's what you need in society. All these things. Why would it be any different with education? That's the first part. The second part, no. Okay. I don't know if you ever heard the saying. You ever heard the saying? Hold your belly button. It's this saying of like, what I'm going to say. Is just hold it a little bit. Now, I'm not advocating for this necessarily. I'm not. I'm slightly playing devil's advocate, but I like to hear the counter argument. So you're the perfect person to give me this. But each country is a little different, of course, based on their history. But when you do have people that come from different countries and they immigrate to certain places, you do need to have some accommodation. You have to have some assimilation, of course, especially if you're living there permanently. What's wrong with a bit of nationalism in terms of like a healthy nationalism of saying you remember your previous citizens, the hard work that they did. In some cases, people, go to war and they die for things. Remembering the elements of things, that how they started things. When someone builds a constitution or they build a way of doing things, or we have certain events. Like, you want to have some. There are. Let me give a sort of a kind of false dichotomy here, but you'll get the point. You have to build, with social cohesion, something to build around. And in many places, you have, what do you build around? You build around religion. You build around a deity. And we see the violence and misadventures of that, right? While nationalism itself is not perfect, it's honestly, lines drawn in a map, and a nation was there, and it wasn't there thousands of years ago in some cases. But, there's certain people groups and ethnic groups, things like that. That's probably a little bit more broadly defined in many parts of the world. But, post World War I, for better or for worse, we got lines on a map and we have nations, and we say, okay, we love the country of France. That's our country. We love the country of Turkey. We love the country of Greece. We love whatever it is, and everyone's got their history. I mean, what's wrong with teaching kids to have these components where you're not really thinking about it. You're saying you got to know who our country's founder was and what our founding documents were and these important parts. And yeah, maybe you have a holiday or a song or an allegiance or whatever. So, these are kind of two things I'm asking. One is about the child development, the cognitive abilities, blah, 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 concrete versus abstract as we kind of grow. Okay. And keeping kind of some constancy and some routine, some order. And then, my kind of devil's advocate here of a little bit of healthy nationalism for people to have that. Fight me on this. Tell me why this is not the way. Tell me why. Argue with me a little bit on this. Why am I wrong on this?
So let me go step by step. There are some points also in common between both your questions, but I'll address them sequentially. The first thing is what's wrong with having a little control over what we put in people's head, in particular, this idea that you need some amount of order and routine for people to actually learn other things, right? I think what's interesting, and I'm not an expert in this sense, I would defer to people who are experts in developmental psychology, for example, but I know there are people who study the development of critical thinking skills who have found that kids are actually very capable of critical thinking. And I think intuitively, this is something I've experienced with young kids who, like, when they say, I want another scoop of ice cream, and you're like, well, that's not good. And they're like, why? And they'll come up with very elaborate arguments when they're like 4 years old for why they should have another scoop of ice cream or whatever it is that they want to do. They are coming up with elaborate arguments. We still don't want them to have another scoop of ice cream, and we might end up saying, well, that's the end of it. You're not getting another scoop of ice cream because I say so. And when we say that, this is the way it's going to be because I say so, we're essentially suppressing that conversation. And we are suppressing that kid's inherent curiosity and inherent desire to engage with you. And so I think that's the place where school becomes problematic, when that's what the school does. Do you need kids to arrive at a certain time of the day so that they're not all arriving at different times of the day and it's not disruptive for the ones who are already there? Okay, maybe there are some things that we could all agree are good. But I also think that there are a lot of rules that kids are subjected to that are there more for the purpose of saying you have to do this because it's what the school says you have to do, or because that's what the teacher says you have to do, than because it's actually a reasonable thing that people, even adults who engaged in a conversation over this, would agree that that's a good thing. So schools that may have, for instance, you can't dye your hair, you can't wear your shirt out of your trousers, you can't go to the bathroom without the teacher's permission, even when you are 15 years old, and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of things that schools require that are there more for the sake of exerting the teachers and the school's authority than because those things are reasonable.
But this isn't an idealistic world. Like, in many ways, I totally grant you, yes, kids can be very intuitive and they can have critical thinking even at 4 years old. There's the phenomenology of how they experience things. I don't disagree with any of that. But that's not every kid.
Oh, yeah. And so that's the interesting.
But like, you know what I mean? That becomes, it's like, okay, I have a classroom of 30 kids, or I have a school of 1,500 kids. There are some kids that are going to do that, and they're great. And maybe they have good parents, or they have a different home life or whatever. But there's maybe 2/3 of the class is not going to do that. How do we handle that?
That's a quite interesting perspective. And I don't know if this is what I'm going to say next is your perspective necessarily.
Not necessarily. No.
No. What I'm going to say next. What I'm going to say next, I'm not going to attribute it to you. But there's also a perspective that there's kids who come from families with more problems, lower income backgrounds. Those kids need more routine, more order, more discipline. Whereas kids whose parents are more supportive, who are better able to stimulate them at home, maybe those kids can have a different type of education. And what's quite interesting is that there are alternative approaches to teaching that suggest that that's not actually accurate. There are charter schools in the United States, here in San Diego, for example, where kids learn in a way that places the student, much more at the center of the learning process, where the curriculum is much more student-centered than teacher-centered. And many of those schools are especially focused on serving low-income children. And those children engage with the material that they are learning much more so than when it's coming from this top-down disciplinary approach. So I would also suggest that the evidence itself suggests that kids of all backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, can actually learn in a way that engages them and treats them in some ways with greater respect. And it is intuitive, right? Like, which kid can you imagine would disengage, think of any kid, would they disengage more when there's being told, sit still, learn this by heart, memorize this because I say so, or are they going to learn stuff because you're engaging with them, encouraging their curiosity? I mean, I don't think it's really controversial to argue that the latter approach is going to engage kids more and that therefore they're going to learn more through that approach. But again, these are some charter schools that have experienced with this. Some public schools as well in the country have more of this approach, but they are the minority. They're not the norm. And around the world, these types of pedagogical approaches are the oddity, not the norm. The other thing, though, that I would also say with respect to your second question is what's wrong with having some set of common values that everyone learns? And you can call it nationalism, you can call it something else, right? But some set of common values that everyone in school learns as part of a project of social cohesion. Well, the question then would be, who determines what those values are? Because from a Rawlsian perspective, if you place yourself in a Rawls framework, none of us would want someone else to determine what those values are, right? And the issue that the book identifies is not necessarily with the fact that values are being taught, but rather that they are being imposed from the top, and those values that are being inculcated, there's no room for questioning them. So, and that's where I see that as fundamentally non-democratic. And it's particularly paradoxical that you would have that type of approach in a democracy. On one hand, you're telling kids, democracy is the best system in the world, and in a democracy, everybody has the right to vote their own, sort of based on their own perspective, to freely express their opinion. And at the same time that you're saying all of this, the message you're sending by imposing this type of message and having kids internalize it without subjecting that idea to debate is that actually there are certain things that are not allowed for debate. So it's essentially a very non-democratic way of educating. And John Dewey was someone who was very critical of this approach, who said, look, the school setup, the way that the operations within the school, decisions within the school are being made, should be a lot more democratic. Kids should have a say over, are we going to learn statistics by working on a project on violence, or a project on baseball, or a project on whatever, dolls? Let the kids have a say over this. Let them debate with one another. Let them come to agreement over what rules do we all want to abide by, what happens when we don't abide by those rules, what do we think are going to be the consequences of that, and so on and so forth. It was a proposal for an approach to education where from a very young age the kids were being taught to participate in a democracy, as opposed to being taught, you have to do this because we say so, and not learn to think for themselves. You can't have a democracy that's strong, in my view at least, without people who are equipped to think critically. Because then what happens is you've learned in school to internalize and memorize democracy is the best form of government. And then when someone comes around who says, maybe we don't need a democracy after all, you're not equipped with a response to that, because you haven't learned what are the potential advantages and disadvantages of democracy. You haven't engaged with the notion that democracy is the best system in the world in a serious, deep way. And so, in the same way that someone once told you and you accepted democracy is the best system in the world, someone else might come around and teach you something different or say something different, and you might just flock to that authoritarian leader. So I think that it's also for the very sake of the democracy that you're trying to defend, it is in that democracy's own interest to have a lot more critical thinking and a much more democratic way of organizing the school.
Those are good points. Those are very, very good points. Yeah, I mean, again, I don't necessarily believe these ways. I think I can hear the counter arguments from, and I'm sure you've heard these counter arguments too from people in dialoguing on this topic, that some people will say, well, that's what you need. You need to teach people values and you know, all these things.
Can I say something to this?
Yeah.
This is a frequent thing that people react to when they read the book is, well, exactly what you said before, like, even in a democracy, you need some level of indoctrination that democracy is the best form of government, right? And what I think that belief reflects is the same fear that was present in the political rulers that set up the education system in absolutist Prussia. It's this fear that if you encourage people to think for themselves, they're gonna take up in arms and destroy everything. And we don't actually have evidence that that's actually what would happen, right? Like, I know a lot of people who are very serious, deep critical thinkers who don't go around destroying everything, who engage in thoughtful conversations and disagreements and back and forth, and they use their critical thinking skills not to destroy stuff, but to engage in productive debates with other people. And so why would we expect that if more people had access to critical thinking skills, they would destroy, but we wouldn't? We wouldn't do that, but they would, right? Like there's sort of this like interesting, and this happens, by the way, on a lot of different domains. We think we're different. Everyone else will behave different, but we won't, right? There's studies on this that I'm just gonna go like into a completely different topic now, but there's studies, for instance, where people are asked, if I give you $13,000 a year, are you going to work any less? And people say, no, of course not. But if you ask people, if I give someone else $13,000 a year, like a cash transfer, are they going to work less? Oh, of course they would work less. And so we have we apply a different standard to other people than we do to ourselves. And I think this happens equally with the concern we have that other people will develop critical thinking, but we do deserve the critical thinking. It's just other people that are dangerous.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of people they get stuck in this kind of mindset sometimes of like, yeah, that's always going to be other people that do it, but not me, not us. That's not going to happen that way. I agree with that. Tell me about something you said in the book that I thought was interesting. You said that state-regulated primary education systems emerged before representative democracy, and that's very critical, the timeline of this. Why is that important to understand that we had this state-regulated thing before we had the democracy we know in the U.S. and kind of in a modern era? Why is that kind of critical to know that piece?
I'll explain the why before. Let me say a little bit about the actual evidence, right? One of the very common arguments before I wrote this book about what led to the expansion of access to primary education was that it was driven by the spread of democracy, that once people had access to the right to vote, they demanded that governments give them education to level the playing field, to get better jobs, and so on and so forth. If that were indeed true, what you would have to see is that the creation and especially the expansion of access to primary education occurred primarily after democracy came around. And that is not what we observe. What we observe in the Western world, particularly in European and Latin American countries, is that the creation of national primary education systems regulated by the state preceded the arrival of democracy by an average of 100 years. And by the time democracy first came around, countries had already accomplished 70% of enrollment in primary education. And democracy, the arrival of democracy, didn't lead to a further acceleration in the rate of access to primary education. And so this tells you, okay, clearly these systems have a non-democratic root. And I think that that's what's important to understand, is that the primary education systems that were created back then, that then continued to the present with some changes here and there, but these were non-democratic inventions, and they were designed first in absolutist Russia, with this logic of breaking the child's will and making the child completely submissive to the king's authority. And that very authoritarian model was the one that became the model for the rest of the world, even for countries that had a democracy, like the United States. Horace Mann traveled to Prussia to learn about how Prussia organized its schools, and then came back when he was secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education and said, we need to emulate Prussia's approach, and we need to do a lot more in the form of moral and political education in school, and we need to teach kids that the only legitimate way of expressing discontent is by voting and never through rebellion, and so on and so forth. But the point is that these systems that we have, and the features of these systems that we were talking about earlier, with the teachers standing in the front and the students sitting in rows, as opposed to kids like maybe moving around to explore this set of projects here and those projects in the other corner, and that very different approach. These systems that we have and this setup came from an authoritarian, absolutist regime. And so I think that that's important to understand the legacy, that these were not systems that were designed to create people who are able to engage in deliberation, in debate, and so on and so forth. The goal was really to suppress the critical thinking and the debate, not the contrary.
And you mentioned shortly after that left-wing autocracies also, it's a sort of a different story as well. So that in expanding primary education, but it doesn't explain the expansion of state-regulated primary education in the West. What's the kind of picture here with left-wing autocracies?
So there are some left-wing autocracies. So if you think, for instance, of like the Soviet Union under Stalin, made a huge expansion of primary education, and it was driven in part because of the efforts at a very rapid industrialization. And that the Stalinist regime wanted everyone in the population to have the technical and scientific skills to contribute to rapid industrialization. And it was also driven by a logic of indoctrinating people in communist ideology. Now, in the context of the Western world, first in Europe, you didn't really have sort of the left-wing autocracies, the authoritarian regimes or non-democratic regimes of the 19th century were usually monarchies that were not left-wing, and those were the ones that were expanding access to primary education and setting up these state-regulated primary education systems where the state regulates the curriculum and how teachers should be certified and trained and so on. In the case of Latin America, you do have left-wing authoritarian regimes, especially in the 20th century, but the expansion happens usually earlier than the arrival of those regimes. It starts in the 19th century under oligarchic regimes that are not left-wing, And then by the time that you start seeing these left-wing authoritarian regimes, many of them are actually sort of halting the expansion of primary education. There's many countries that, even though they did have a left-wing authoritarian regime, it was not that regime the one that expanded primary education the most. So even though sort of the left-wing authoritarian regimes do explain the expansion of education in the non-Western world, for the Western world, that's not very much of a valid explanation.
Now, one thing here that I'm curious about is the role of, well, there are two things here, but when we look at countries in the world that don't have good education systems, so I guess you could look at, we don't call them third world countries anymore, whatever the term that we call them now is, very poor countries, and the literacy rates are really low. That's not a positive thing either, right? We don't want people to be literate, but we also don't want them to be indoctrinated either. And we don't want them to have this whole system of mass education the way that you've been describing. What would you say for the countries that unfortunately still have high illiteracy rates? It sounds like there's just, it can't be like, I could ask this in the other way too. What are countries that do this well, where they have good mass education, but it's not, all these things of social order. It really is for critical thinking and to have education, things like that. I guess I'm looking at the kind of spectrum here of the positive, negative. We have places in the world where they don't get that. That's not good. But we also have places where they do get that. And do we see that in a positive way where they're not having some indoctrination? What's the kind of landscape of that?
Spectrum, right?
Yeah.
So this goes back to, so I gathered data on the extent to which countries in the post-war period from 1945 to the present have engaged in indoctrination efforts through their education systems. The data that I gathered with a team of social scientists in other universities is for 160 countries. And we asked education experts in all of these 160 countries, an average of 5 education experts per country, to answer a number of questions, such as, for example, when kids are learning how to read and write, are they using texts that emphasize patriotism, or are they using texts that don't emphasize patriotism? When kids are learning history, are they being taught a single interpretation of historical events, or are they being exposed to multiple different interpretations of historical events? When kids are being taught history, are they encouraged or allowed to question what they're being taught, or is that subject to reprimand if they question some of the things that they're being taught? And so we asked a whole range of different things. To what extent are patriotic symbols celebrated in school, and how frequently, and so on and so forth. And so here goes back to the question you were asking about the spectrum. Almost every country in the world engages in indoctrination. And I'd rather say all countries in the world engage in some indoctrination, some more so than others. But that's sort of the constant, that indoctrination continues to be heavily present in what most education systems around the world do. Now, there are countries that have tried to move away from that more than others. And so I would place Finland there as an example of a country that has tried and done a lot to reform the education system to promote more critical thinking, at the same time that it still does have its indoctrination component, but where there is more room for students to engage in developing seriously their critical thinking skills. So that would be sort of, maybe Finland would be sort of in the extreme end. Ontario, Canada also has done a lot in recent years. Finland started doing this more in the 1970s. In the case of Ontario, in Canada, it's more recent. And then you have countries that are in the opposite end. Countries, there's a recent study done by a team of researchers at the Center for Global Development, where they conducted surveys among 900 education policymakers in 36 developing countries in Africa and Asia. And they asked these people to tell them, what do you think are the main goals that an education system should accomplish? And they asked things, they designed the survey in a way such that people wouldn't necessarily realize that they were telling their genuine opinion, because they wanted them to disclose things that might not be what they want to disclose truly. But essentially, through this research technique, what they found was that these 900 education policymakers in 36 countries in Asia and Africa were much more interested in education promoting a dutiful citizenry than a literate citizenry. They were much more interested in dutiful than in literate citizens. And so there you have kind of the other extreme, right? Of societies that continue not to be particularly interested in equipping people with even basic literacy. We're not talking about math, science, but very basic literacy skills. They're just much more interested in having these docile, obedient citizens who abide by the law, who respect the state's authority, often in many cases extremely corrupt governments that are trying to use the education system to perpetuate their own power. So you have kind of those two extremes, and then in between you have many other cases.
I'm going to come to indoctrination in a minute, but first tell us, because it's sort of kind of coming to it, is this piece of mass education is trying to quell against internal and external conflict. And so whether it's civil wars or other wars or kind of skirmishes between other groups of people within a country or actual wars between countries, when we look at interstate wars or when we look at internal wars, how is mass education used to kind of reduce or prevent seemingly violence as a main way to prevent that?
So I'll go in steps here, because the answers are very different when we talk about internal conflict versus external interstate conflict. So very briefly, let me say, with respect to external conflict, I don't find evidence that drives the expansion of primary education in the Western world. You do see in the non-Western world some evidence that when countries outside the West have to face wars with other countries, that leads them to expand education, not only for the sake of having a skilled soldier population or our skilled army, but also for sort of this notion of instilling patriotism and inoculating citizens from foreign threats that might want to invade the territory and persuade people to defect, essentially. You see that logic in the non-West. In the Western world, interstate wars do not lead to the expansion of primary education in general. They do lead to sort of a recovery of enrollment in education, because during the war there's a decline in enrollment in education, and after the war there's a partial recovery, but it's not new enrollment above and beyond what we would have seen if the war hadn't taken place. That's for external wars, and that's an important finding, because it does challenge a common belief that military rivalry between states is what prompted Prussia and other European powers to educate the population. I don't find evidence for that. Looking at evidence from 40 countries in Europe and Latin America, the evidence just doesn't align with that explanation. What I do find is that internal conflict does strongly and consistently predict the expansion of primary education. And the logic behind that is that the ideas that circulated since the 18th century among political rulers about what mass education could accomplish for these rulers, these were ideas that highlighted, yes, if the state were to take charge over the education of children, it could use that education to instill respect for the state's authority, and that would strengthen the state's political power. But in the absence of episodes of internal conflict that actually threatened the authority of the state, political rulers didn't think that they needed to invest in education, because they thought, like, why am I gonna invest a lot of resources? It's a huge sort of enterprise and fiscal commitment. Why would I build so many schools, hire and train so many teachers, when I don't really need to instill obedience in children because my population is behaving well? The occurrence of an episode of internal conflict does is it leads these political rulers to update their beliefs about the need for education. Suddenly, when an internal conflict occurs, political rulers come to believe that the tools that they have available to them up to that point, such as threatening to repress the population or actually repressing them, or giving the population economic concessions, or relying on the church for moral education, that those tools are clearly insufficient, because we just had an episode of social revolt, or peasant revolt, or civil war, or insurrection, rebellion, rural riots, and so on and so forth. Many different types of internal conflict that essentially heighten these political rulers' fear of the masses and lead them to view the masses as these unruly, savage, barbarian members of society who need to be placed in school for the sake of preventing something of that nature, of that kind of internal conflict, from ever happening again. And so that's sort of the catalyzing power of internal conflict that I document in the book through different cases and also through quantitative evidence showing that, for instance, civil wars are the most consistent predictor of the expansion of primary school enrollment rates in the Western world, much more so than democratization or industrialization or interstate wars.
It's such a sobering analysis in some.
Yeah.
I mean, I know conflict motivates people, but Jesus, I mean, that's, it is a sobering thought.
It's conflict and it's fear. It's the fear that motivates these elites.
Yeah.
It's the sense of, oh my gosh, we're all gonna get killed. Oh my gosh, the institutions that enable us to have the privileges that we enjoy are gonna be destroyed by these people if we don't put them all in a school and teach them to stay put and teach them that the status quo is actually okay, that there's nothing to rebel against. So it's really, it's the fear that activates all of these education reforms.
Yes, it's very salient for our time. So, okay, let's talk about indoctrination. We've mentioned it a handful of times. You in the book walk this tightrope. I think you tried to say what you mean by indoctrination, what a lot of people mean by it. There's a lot of nuance here. It's obviously a loaded word. It's a loaded word. It's a big big word. It gets thrown around a lot too. I don't like something, it's indoctrination. That kind of thing. Obviously, you're very careful about this stuff. So, how do you define indoctrination for the uses that you're using it for the book and for your research? And why is this such a hard kind of landmine to navigate?
So let me say how I define it and how I don't define it. I follow the dictionary's definition of indoctrination. If you do a Google search of indoctrination, it's going to tell you indoctrination is the process of teaching someone to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And if you think a little bit about this definition, the focus, what makes something indoctrination, is not the content. From this perspective, it's not the content of what's being taught. From this perspective, you can indoctrinate someone to believe that democracy is the best form of government, and you can also indoctrinate someone to believe that communism is the best form of government. You can indoctrinate someone to believe that God is great, and you can indoctrinate someone to believe that God is evil. You can indoctrinate someone to believe that we have the things we have as a result of our merit, and you can indoctrinate people to believe that we have the things we have as a result of our lack. What makes something indoctrination, according to the dictionary, is not the content of what's being taught, it's that the process of teaching these beliefs does not allow critical thinking. And so that goes back to what you were saying before. I can't label something as indoctrination simply because it's engaging with a series of ideas that I don't like. But it does constitute indoctrination if those ideas are being taught in a way that does not allow children to question, to challenge, to ask, but why? If the moment that kids ask, but why, they're being either reprimanded, sent to the principal's office, labeled as problematic, or shut down and suppressing that, and the teacher is saying, well, because I say so, then that becomes indoctrination.
You know, I just as a side note here, I mean, I teach graduate students. Mm-hmm. And you teach graduate students or undergrad?
I teach undergraduate, master's, and PhD students.
Yeah, I've taught doctorate students before as well. And I'm so, and I understand some of the reasons why, but I'm always so sad by many of the young people. No, not all. There's some really, some classes I have where it's not this way, but overall, it's such a neutered environment in the classroom where everyone's afraid to ask a question. They don't want to ask because they don't want to get it wrong, or they don't want to, they said the wrong thing and then they're going to get ostracized by their peers. And I find myself having to, because I love when people ask questions and they have good critical thinking and they think outside the box, and they, especially in a class, like that is the environment where you're supposed to do that, right? I understand, family, holidays, and if you're at a job, or if you're, okay, you're going to have to do the, button up or whatever. But in a classroom, that's where you should explore those things. You should challenge and explore and try new ideas, and maybe it's totally crazy. That's okay. You have to try and see, and it's the process of learning. And I just get really sad when they don't want to ask, or I really have to pull it out of them. Even if I'm saying all the concessions, like, you can say what you want, I promise it's fine. It just takes a lot for people nowadays. I don't know if you see the same thing.
No, absolutely. And that's exactly that's
the indoctrination from primary education.
The K-12 system. Uh-huh. Yeah, historically, the university has been the place where professors try to encourage more critical thinking, and the K-12 system doesn't do that. So you get kids arrive in university and they're just not used to thinking for themselves. That's the bottom line. They're not used to thinking for themselves. They're used to memorizing whatever the teacher tells them that they need to memorize to get a good grade. And that's what's really the challenge when you are a university instructor, is how to get kids to change their mindset, how to try to get them excited about thinking for themselves. But it's tough because they want to know, but just tell me what's the right answer that I need to know so that I do well in the exam. And they get upset when there isn't a unique answer. They get upset when you don't give them the answer, just like this is the study guide that you need to memorize. And I think the reality is that it's becoming even worse with artificial intelligence tools.
Oh yeah.
Sort of idea, or tendency for students to give up their power to think for themselves. They are devolving to a machine. Essentially, they're just typing the prompt, copy pasting the result without even checking the answer. And that's giving up a lot of their power. So that I think if anything, I think artificial intelligence for me makes the need to reform education systems, including K-12 education systems, all the more urgent, because it highlights just how problematic it is. If we don't reform education systems to encourage critical thinking, we're going to have a long generation of people who can't think for themselves.
There's a lot of danger in that. Obviously, there's a lot of danger in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many things we could keep going on with the indoctrination, the environments, but I do want to ask about quickly about curriculums. We mentioned it at some point in the conversation earlier, and this. I mean, you and I both live in the U.S., so you see these arguments all the time about people have. It's on all sides of the aisle politically, that people argue about curriculums, right? And in the United States, I'll just say, in 2001, we had the No Child Left Behind. Then we had, I think, Common Core during, I think, the Obama years. I think that's right. And we just never have, no one's ever happy with national curriculums that are done. You'll hear certain states do certain things, and people from outside will judge it, people from inside will judge it. It just feels like no one's ever happy with any curriculum, and then some people overcorrect, some people undercorrect, some people censor, some people, it's all over the place, and it's the thing we fight about the most. Pick your soapbox or whatever it is of the moment, and that's gonna inspire and motivate parents to go to the school board meeting and yell at whoever's on the school board locally and be like, I don't want this one thing in there. Take your pick. It's a mess. I mean, it's a mess. I mean, it's a mess. And look, listen, I think I've always really thought this, but I think this even more so now over the past couple of years, especially in primary school. Teachers and educators are some of the most important people we have in society. I think is so essential, and they have the hardest jobs. I think them and nurses, and I wish our society was in the inverse, where they got paid the most, and people that were hedge fund people were got paid the least. You know what I mean? Like they're the people that should be getting hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, all the work they do and everything. And it just yeah. But so it's very difficult. But how do you reform something people don't even agree on? How do you improve on something? Quality education is super important. That teachers are doing a good job teaching very well at all stages, primary, secondary, in higher ed. But how do we have this, state curriculums and national curriculums of compulsory education? But that's the thing people fight about. How do you navigate that? That's a labyrinth. How do you navigate it?
It's a tough question. I don't have an answer for that.
Nobody does. I don't know. It's a hard one.
But I think that the issue of the content of the curriculum speaks and the reason why these debates over the content of the curriculum are so heated is precisely because people think that whatever the curriculum content is, whatever content you're exposed to in school, is something that's going to shape your lifelong attitudes, beliefs, ideas, and so on and so forth. So there's I think that's what at the heart of people fighting so much.
It's a value thing. It's that values thing that you were mentioning earlier. Yeah.
But what I think is interesting is that from an empirical standpoint, from a social science perspective, there isn't that much of a strong evidence base that is actually true. People tend to think that that whatever the curriculum says is what the students will internalize, and that's certainly what the states thought when 19th century states in Europe, Latin America were imposing a national curriculum with this idea of I'm going to teach you to obey the state. But there's several studies done by economists, political scientists, that show that sometimes the content of the curriculum actually backfires, that people end up, because humans have agency, or because the textbooks didn't arrive, or the teachers decided not to teach, and this, I'll go back to your point about teachers, not to teach the curriculum exactly as it was meant to be taught according to the state. Or because parents are at home countering what the school is trying to teach, and so for a variety of different reasons, schools might not actually be as important in shaping people's long-term values and beliefs as we might think. There's a really interesting study, and timely, I think, by Vicky Fuka, who's at Stanford University, who looked at what was the consequence of a series of education policies after World War I that several states adopted prohibiting instruction in German. So the idea was, well, we just fought a war against Germany, and Germany is the enemy, and the goal behind prohibiting instruction in German in schools in the United States was to assimilate German Americans more into American culture, American identity, strengthen their American identity, and weaken their German identity. And what she finds is that the consequence of this language prohibition was the opposite. It actually led, when schools prohibited instruction in German, parents started investing more so in German American parents and German parents started investing more so in ensuring that their kids wouldn't lose their ties to Germany. And so those kids who were exposed to those language prohibitions were more likely to marry other German Americans, were less likely to volunteer for World War II, and another host of things that were actually, they became even more German oriented in their identity than they would have if the state hadn't prohibited German from being taught in school. So this is just one of a number of studies that have found that sometimes these efforts to control the curriculum do backfire. And so I bring this up because I think that it's that people should keep this in mind. When they're fighting so much over the curriculum, it's not always going to turn out the way you want it to turn out. With respect to the role of teachers, and teachers being incredibly important, I'll bring here also another study that was done by Raj Chetty and others, I think more than a decade ago now. But basically, they were looking at how much should we pay teachers if we were paying them based on how much they contributed to the US economy. And what they found was, like, in terms of sort of the knowledge and skills that they are passing on to students and how those students' economic productivity then affects the country's overall GDP, right? And so their estimates concluded that teachers, the average teacher, not the best teacher, just the kind of the median teacher, the one at the center of the distribution of good and bad teachers, should earn around $300,000 per year. Very different from what teachers make in the US. But there's a history behind, and I talk briefly about it in the book to some extent in chapters 5, about, I think, why teachers are underpaid. And it has to do, in the case of the US and Latin America, some of it has to do with the approach that was taken toward suddenly expanding education very quickly. And you needed to hire a lot of teachers. And where were you going to get so many teachers and be able to afford paying them salaries? Where both in the US and in Latin America, many politicians made the case that you needed to hire women because women were going to be cheaper. And so you end up historically with this profession that has a very strong, important role to play in society, in the economy, and so on, that by design was a low-paid profession because you were trying to hire a lot of people, and the way they found was to just hire a lot of women who at that time didn't have really other job opportunities. And so that was sort of the economic calculation that they made. We can keep talking about teachers because there's a lot of other things also that I think are important with respect to the way teachers are trained. In many countries around the world, the training of teachers continues to focus a lot more on teaching them behavior, like student behavior management, teaching them history of education, philosophy of education, and so forth, and so on and so forth, and not so much instruction in how to be an effective science teacher, how to be an effective math teacher. That kind of training comes from the goals of the 19th century teacher training institutions. They weren't trying to get teachers to be good at teaching skills. They were trying to get teachers to be good at managing student behavior. And so they had a lot of history of education and philosophy of education classes to convince teachers about how important their role was in transforming citizens into morally upright citizens, and then they had all of these techniques for how do you manage classroom behavior, because that was the goal. And many countries continue to have that focus.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, we could talk for hours and hours. I agree on teachers, and again, I you know, maybe we can do that. You know, I'll have you come back on, and you can tell me. We can just talk about teachers and quality education. We'll do 3 hours on it, you know, for sure. I mean, there's so many things to discuss there.
Yeah.
One quick thing before my last question. This is a footnote. If you don't want to say anything, that's fine. But you know, it's been the kind of you know, fantasy of obsession of Republicans in the United States, politically as the party, to not have a Department of Education. They've been fantasizing about this for as long as I've been alive, I think. And we're getting a lot of muscle behind that with the current administration. I'll just generalize it. I mean, what do you think? I mean, you know, I mean, there's a lot of, look, I mean, I have my view on it. You know, I'm a good liberal, so I like centralized federated republics, right? I like federal government, centralized, you know, strong centralized federal government. That's what I like. But you've posed a lot of challenges and problems with indoctrination, with all these things. And look, you could say, well, you take out the Department of Education, but you're just going to have states doing it 50 different ways and still indoctrinating all these things. Like, you could make that argument too, I guess. But or you might have some states that do it better and some states that do it worse or whatever, even if you don't have it. But I don't know. What do you think about as a legitimate proposal, as a legitimate thing, not as, you know, sensationalized things or whatever that some politicians do? But I don't know. What do you think about this?
More as a philosophical rather than the specific details of the U.S. case. If you're asking for my opinion about the role of the state in regulating education or not, because I think it's a worthy question to engage with, because sometimes like, people read the book and they come away thinking, well, like, if the state has used education to indoctrinate, we should get rid of public education. We should privatize everything, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's an inaccurate reading of the book, because the book doesn't say anything, doesn't provide any kind of evidence to suggest that private schools are any better than public schools, or that private schools indoctrinate any less than public schools. In fact, one of the things that the book
I was going to say, probably more.
One of the things that the book argues, and this has been extensively documented by historians, so it's not my claim, but it was the church that pioneered the use of education for indoctrination. States then took on that and brought it to a different scale, but it was a non-state actor, the one that chose to put kids in a classroom or a room, essentially, and all of these techniques, for example, that we were talking about earlier from Prussia, about having the teacher stand in front of the class and the kids arranged in rows so that the teacher could look at all the kids and could monitor, supervise how they were all behaving. This was a type of approach to education that was developed by pietist priests and pietist education reformers, not by the state itself. The state adopted this. So there's really no guarantee whatsoever that the private sector and the non-state education providers would indoctrinate any less. And I think there's just a more general argument and cautionary tale inherent in the book that anyone who has power be it political power or economic power, may have an incentive to use education and schools to perpetuate that power, whether it's a political power in the form of the state, or an economic power, which could be a billionaire that manages a franchise of charter schools. So that's something first just to clarify. Now, with respect to what should be the role of the state in regulating education, this goes to sort of my own belief in sort of the value of autonomy, the idea that every individual should have the right to an education that gives them the capabilities to live life with liberty, to live life in accordance to their dreams, to pursue those dreams, to figure out what their values are, what are the values that they want to sort of embody. And so from that standpoint of an education that promotes autonomy, you do need a state that ensures that. You need a state that maybe you do allow a lot of private providers, you do allow homeschooling, you do allow a lot of different forms of different actors that provide education, including maybe the state itself as well, or governments, local, subnational, whatever. But where the state does regulate the curriculum to ensure that kids are not being taught things just so that they are an extension of their parents, for example, so that the kid can develop their own sense of identity, their own liberty, to live life with liberty, right? And so I do think that there's a role for states to play there. The one thing I'll say, just I think we could have, again, a different conversation another day on the case of the United States. But I do think that sort of it's important in these conversations about the getting rid of the Department of Education. It's important to realize that the federal government doesn't have the authority to make education policy directly. It cannot, unlike in almost every other country in the world, the federal government here cannot say this is going to be the national curriculum that everyone has to teach. The Constitution doesn't give the federal government that power. The only power that the federal government has over education is the power it can exert through funding. So the federal government can try to persuade state governments, which are the ones that have the constitutional authority to make curriculum decisions. The federal government can try to sort of persuade state governments to adopt the federal government's preferred curriculum by saying, if you teach this curriculum, I'm gonna offer you a grant. And that's what the Obama administration did, for example, when they were trying to have states evaluate teachers' performance based on how students performed in standardized test scores. Obama wanted to promote that type of teacher evaluation system, and he put a series of grants raised to the top and said, like, any state that adopts this, I'm going to give you grants. Same thing during the 1960s. The federal government wanted school districts in the South to desegregate, and it said, I'm going to give you Title I funds if you desegregate. But it couldn't do it through a national law. It's through this sort of funding mechanism. And so even if in the US, the Department of Education disbands, I don't think the Republican Party really wants to get rid of its power to influence education in the states. I think what you would have is that the Office of Title I, that's currently housed in the Department of Education, might move to the Department of Health and Human Services. But through that office, they will probably want to do things that are along the lines of, if you don't teach patriotic education, then you don't get federal funds. You can still not teach patriotic education, right? And then you would have to use your state and local funds to fund that education. Again, the federal government cannot impose a curriculum, but it can use its funding to sort of try to influence the policy that states and districts make. And that's what all governments have done, liberal, conservative, and I don't think that it's likely that Republicans would want to give up that power.
Well, they're certainly going to keep campaigning on it, but in reality, I don't know if they're going to want to give it up. So my last question here, give me the 2-minute abstract of your book, the thesis, just to summarize. And what is the, one or two big things, big takeaways you hope readers get? You have a lot of content, a lot of history, a lot of data. You have some spicy bits in there, indoctrination, things like that. So there's a lot of things in there. What is the one or two takeaways you would want readers to come away with from your book?
That's a tough question. 2 minutes. Yeah, I'll be maybe even less than that. I'll say sort of, I would talk about this book, about a book that's motivated by this disconnect that we observe around the world between schooling and skills, the fact that we have universal primary education virtually everywhere, and yet children are not learning even basic reading, writing, math skills. And so the book tries to understand this disconnect by going back in time to understand what prompted governments to set up primary education systems available to everyone in the first place. Was it driven by actually trying to promote skills, or was it driven by a different set of goals? And what I find is something that to some extent was surprising to me, or to a large extent was surprising to me and unsettling as well, which is that the primary education systems that we started observing unfolding around the Western world, in particular in the 19th century and to the present, were not designed with the goal of leveling the playing field, empowering people, giving people the tools to escape poverty, and so on and so forth. They were developed with a social control agenda in mind. And the goal primarily was to instill obedience to political rulers and their authority and the rules that they adopted. And that sort of coercive, disciplinary character of education systems that I document historically with data from many different countries and all kinds of data, statistical data looking at the content of what parliamentary debates said with respect to what were the political arguments that were being made to expand education to the masses, looking also at the content of the laws, the curriculum, how teachers were being trained and recruited, but all of this evidence pointing to this coercive disciplinary roots of education being there from the get-go, but also persisting to the present. And so I think in terms of moving forward, I think that it's incredibly important to come to terms, to acknowledge this history, this legacy, and to realize that we've inherited systems that were not designed with the goals that we might want education to accomplish today. And that if we want education to accomplish a different set of goals, be that to strengthen democracy, to equip people with the creativity and critical thinking skills that we need to be strong economically in the 21st century, and so on and so forth, and we want an education system that prepares people to live autonomous lives and so on and so forth, we really need to think these systems from the root and transform them so that they are redesigned to serve a different set of goals than the ones that they were intended and designed to accomplish.
That's about 3 minutes, but that was pretty good, though. That's pretty good. Yes, and I agree with you. I think I'm a big proponent of institutional reform. Education is one of our biggest institutions, and I think we need to, I totally agree with that project of trying to, at the root of things, really reform a lot of it. Agustina, this was again such a invigorating and such an engaging conversation. Like I said, the book was very engaging. Talking to you was even more engaging. A true delight. And I was really happy to download your wisdom and your perspective and your intellect for almost 2 hours. I'm so grateful for that. So big thanks for doing that.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation as well. And thanks so much for having me.